And with that, I'm glad we at least are not the NATO left in this call. Or people who have a nostalgia of what Russia was, a million moons ago, and think there's anything progressive about the Putin regime. No, we have to reject that.
I've read Marx. I've read Engels. I've read Das Kapital.
The world is run by Trotskyists.
Hardcore Trotskyists.
How great an anti-American Marxist!
They're controlled by Trotskyists, as you put it, and these are the most evil, sick human beings on the face of the planet.
Is Russia imperialist? Thank you all for coming. Good to have you. I'd like to offer some opening remarks before we start, and that's on the criteria of Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in which he outlined the nature of capitalist and imperialist world powers. At the time, the United States was an emerging imperial power, entering into competition with the waning imperial powers of Great Britain, Belgium, Holland, France, Germany, and Tsarist Russia. But just because the players have changed in the game of world relations doesn't mean the rule book and the fundamental laws of economics have changed. The United States is now the dominant imperialist power in the world, with Tsarist Russia and now even the Soviet Union as a distant memory. Russia and China are coming into their own as the world's superior superpowers, so I think the question of imperialism in regards to Russia is quite relevant and an interesting one. At the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia inherited the largest collection of military arms in the world and a sizable army. With the war in Ukraine dragging on, with NATO and the U.S. playing no small part in stoking the flames, the question of Russian imperialism is relevant as ever because it affects how the international proletariat organizes and helps assess whether the Russian Communist Party was correct in its support for the special military operation. Is the war in Ukraine a reactionary war designed to merely shore up Putin's popularity at home? Is it for territorial expansion for the empires of old? If it is to deprive their economic European rivals of strategic alliances, in this case depriving NATO of Ukraine membership, or is Putin leading the world anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle in the only contradiction that matters to some Marxists, the hegemony of the great Satan, the United States? Or is it something else? Kautsky said that imperialism is the annexation of territories. While correct, Lenin felt that this was incomplete and expanded it on a more scientific basis. 1. The concentration of production and capital has developed in such a high state that it's created monopolies, which play a decisive role in economic life. 2. The merger of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation, on the basis of this finance capital, of a financial oligarchy. 3. The export of capital, as distinguished from the export of commodities, acquires exceptional importance. 4. The formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world amongst themselves. And 5. The territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed. Imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe amongst the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. Lenin stressed that the need to analyze a phenomenon as a living, changing process, not as a mechanical and abstract, rigid definition. Before we open the floor, I do want to make a quick tally of the features that I would argue make Russia imperialist. First, monopoly capitalism. Domestic monopolies comprise 70% of Russia's GDP. In retail, 2 companies have 85% of retail space. In oil refining, 11 oil and gas companies provide 95% of all production. Russian telecommunications is just of 4 different companies. In finance, the central bank in Russia itself started the Russian banking sector as a virtual monopoly or oligarchy. Sberbank is a leading bank in 83 of 85 regions in the country, with VTB closely following. These banks create banking ecosystems which include services for housing, insurance, food delivery, consulting, logistics, air and railway, taxis, and the film industry. Domestic finance capital extends to industrial companies as well, with the bank owners also managing automobile companies and machine plants. Russia ranks 6th in volume of public lending by state mollustic capital into other countries, while their foreign direct investment puts them at 31st. The countries Russia financially exports to are diverse, but are mostly former Soviet bloc countries as well as Venezuela, Bolivia, and Central Africa. A single Russian oil gas company Gazprom, has 41% of the share of gas supplies to Europe. Other domestic monopolies play important roles in the international energy market. Roselsmash is a group of companies that own 17% world market share in agricultural equipment being sold to 50 countries, with 500 facilities across the world. Rostom State Corporation is first in the world for nuclear power plant orders. The Russian Federation ranks second after the United States for international arms sales. However, it is not just about the expansion of markets into other countries to export your commodities to. But imperialism is a struggle for spheres of application and influence. Russian giant Algrosa is in Africa, mining diamonds in Angola and the Congo, while state corporations Ronova Group, Rusal, and other mining non-ferrous metals in South Africa, Gabon, Guyana, and Nigeria, while Rosneft are conducting geological exploration of oil in Egypt, Libya, Syria, Venezuela, and Colombia. Russian Railways is engaged in rail infrastructure in North Korea. If we accept Lenin's definition of imperialism as a domination of monopoly capital, then from a purely economic standpoint, the Russian Federation would appear to be imperialist. For more on this topic, we turn to our friends at the Denver Communist, Firebrand, Independent Socialist Group, and the Left and Workers and Left Voice, all coming together on the Left Opposition podcast. Thank you. So, first up, we do have Mark J. from Firebrand with his remarks for 5 minutes.
10 minutes?
10. Don't mind me.
Okay. Hey, comrades. Aaron kind of just gave my talk for me to a certain extent. But I'm
Thank you and good night. All right, everyone.
But I'm going to focus a little bit more on maybe situating that historically as briefly and broad strokesly as I can. I wanted to start though by making an argument about like why I think this discussion is important. Obviously, right, as Marxists, we need to know what is going on in the world, what is going on politically and economically, geopolitically, internationally. I would argue that the stakes for defining Russia as imperialist are slightly lower than some other conversations about Russia that may have been had in the past. By which I mean not that it's not important, but that I think we could come to similar conclusions about, for example, the situation in Ukraine. I would consider the correct stance to be Russian troops out, no NATO intervention, opposing the US sending arms. You can come to that conclusion without defining Russia as imperialist, but I think it's important that we define Russia that way in order to understand what it has done so far and to anticipate, begin to prepare for responses for what it will do in the future. So I agree with Aaron's outline of Lenin's take on imperialism, especially the part where he mentioned that we're not just rotely applying the same rubric to every new historical situation, but we're taking that as a jumping off point. And I take this to mean that imperialism looks different in different time periods, right? For example, at some point post-World War II under the Marshall Plan, maybe somebody can provide this information, the US wasn't a net exporter of capital. That didn't mean that it wasn't imperialist. It meant that the situation at that moment was different in the early 20th century. So what we're talking about with imperialism is a situation in the development of capitalism where production is global, and those monopoly firms, capitalist enterprises, make use of states to defend their interests. This is a question of capital, the state, and the military, and how those things relate to each other. So to make sense of Russia, I want to just hit two kind of time periods, one being 91 to 2000, one being 2000 into the future, those being the dates of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Putin's rise to power. So the USSR, in case anyone is not familiar, collapsed in 1991. And up until that point, however you define the economy or characterize the economy of the USSR before that, which I'm not going to wade into yet, the development of that economy had an extremely high rate of, or an extremely close relationship between the state and manufacturing and production, right? So with the collapse of that political institution, the consequences were extremely dramatic. You had a situation where what was termed shock therapy was being implemented throughout Russia, which was rapid and extensive privatization of state firms, and the rise of an extremely parasitic billionaire oligarch class. This situation was bad for capital as a whole, though. A few extremely rich people got extremely richer. But the kind of instability of that situation is actually not good for like the aggregate interests of the capitalist class, right? At the same time, you have further instability with some former Soviet republics becoming independent, especially in Central Asia and Ukraine, and some parts that were considered part of Russia proper attempting to become or having conflict around that question, such as in Chechnya and parts of Georgia, or Chechnya at least. So this puts Russia in the situation of needing to maintain its status as a world power. Right, that becomes the primary interest, and through a series of interventions in regional conflicts. I mentioned that the conflict in Chechnya. There was also armed conflict in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and other places. Combined with two severe economic recessions in the 90s, this position as a world power appears to be in pretty severe danger. One of the solutions to this comes in 2000. This is kind of moving into the second stage here, with Vladimir Putin's rise to power, and particularly a concept that he has called the vertical of power, essentially meaning that he's seeking to reassert the authority of the central Russian state. Right, before his rise to power, there was growing authority being assumed by regional governments and things like that, as well as separatist movements and the like. So my notes become illegible. I'm sorry, 1 second. Right. So part of reasserting the authority of the Russian state takes the form of a second war in Chechnya, which had been embarrassing the first time around, and this time was quite bloody. And this is where the question of imperialism starts to come in. Imperialism is, in addition to states making or companies making use of states, it's a system of competition. There's a drive in the international market in an imperialist period that puts states in conflict with each other. So for Russia to maintain and reassert itself as a world power, the options open to it are essentially in what is referred to by Russia as the near abroad, that is the former Eastern Bloc and the countries around Russia. So maintaining hegemony through military and through economic means becomes a priority. So what Russia's trying to do in this period is to break out of some of the constraints that are put on it by its imperialist competition, particularly the US, but it's also being outpaced in terms of its development by China, right? But because of the expansion of NATO, among other factors, this limits Russia essentially to a primarily resource export economy. This is a huge section of the Russian economy, right? It's the export of oil, natural gas, and coal. So does this mean that Russia is not imperialist? I would argue that it's not. Right, because these developments are part of the pattern of imperialist conflict. A country being weaker than another country doesn't mean that it's not imperialist, right? And in fact, very rarely do we see a situation where imperialist rivals are like evenly matched, right? But what is going on in Russia is that they are trying to become a bigger and more dominant imperial power. And part of the way that this is being done is through the control of resources and supply of oil and natural gas in the region. You also see attempts to secure this in the 90s by some fairly intense brinksmanship with Ukraine over the ownership of former military material, as well as control of ports, ownership of nuclear weapons, and the like. So maintaining the dominance of the hegemony in the near abroad is the current stage that Russia's at, and trying to build itself into a larger and more dominant imperial force. And I think I'll leave it there. I'll err on the side of brevity.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Mark. All right. Up next, from the Independent Socialist Group, we have Angus McFarland.
Hey, everybody. So yeah, I'm not finding a ton to disagree with what has been said so far. I think a lot of the sort of economic stuff that Aaron laid out is correct, and I think it's pretty clear that according to that classical, Lenin's sort of classic definition of imperialism, Russia is a fully modern capitalist state at this point, and I don't think it should be controversial that what they're doing, what they're engaging in all over the world is imperialism. Whereas they've been all over Africa, intervening military there, and getting involved in the new scramble for resources in there, and to a certain extent, is but also involved in the Middle East and in Syria, and obviously the war in Ukraine is, there was Aaron put out that list of is it this or that, and I think except for that last one where they were sort of an anti-colonial heroes trying to save the world from U.S. hegemony. Except for that one, I think yes, right. I think it has to do with NATO. I think it has to do with Putin's standing in Putin's position and various other reasons. But I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about in the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Right after that, I think there was a big rush to pick sides, right? And a lot of people, obviously the U.S. position was pretty obvious right away. Started shipping weapons over there as fast as possible, and then I think among the left a little bit there was sort of people picking a side, and we didn't do that, and I think that has that position has been borne out by events. Now, we didn't, obviously we didn't cheer for Putin or Zelensky. We have no illusions that either the Russia under Putin or Ukraine and Zelensky was represents any kind of progressive situation, right? There are some that have those kinds of illusions, but really they're both capitalist states. And I think also he said it right just now, saying that just because you're a smaller or weaker country does not mean that imperialism is not a game engaged in only by equals, right? So there are underdogs and imbalances of power, but that doesn't mean that the West is not, or that Russia is not doing imperialism, or that the West is doing imperialism through Ukraine. But and yeah, so there's nothing progressive about Putin and the oligarchs. They the represent the oligarchs and the rich elites there, and the Ukrainian government under Zelensky is very similar, right? So our position for this was that we obviously think that the Russians should leave Ukraine, back to before this last invasion. We also don't support shipping weapons and fighting to the last Ukrainian. We are on the side always and everywhere of the working class, right? And the working class has enemies, and it is the Ukrainian government and the Russian government, right? The Russian ruling class and the Ukrainian ruling class. So we really don't believe that the working class has a dog in the fight here, and as is, I think, the best Marxist take, has more in common with each other than they do with either of their ruling classes. Let's see. Yeah, so it's been 3 years. It's been an ongoing meat grinder. Casualties are horrific. The ridiculous sort of little tit for tat escalation of shipping more and new kinds of weapons in there that Biden has been doing, has been sort of very carefully calibrated to continue the war, to keep the war going on, and to sort of try to bleed Russia, which has been a sort of a strategy going back to certainly through the Soviet Union and dealing with them in Afghanistan. But the only way really that we can resolve this, right, and that to really win peace would be building socialist movements in both countries, right? So, I think as Marxists, we always have to be really, really careful when we are being asked to divide along axes other than class, right? That should really be where we live. So, that being said, right, that's clearly not something that is in the immediate future. But other than there may be, I mean, who knows what might happen in the future. There are a lot of sort of possibilities, but none of them involve without fight for socialism in Ukraine and in Russia. None of them involve the liberation of the working class. None of them involve lasting peace. None of them involve liberation. So I think we have to keep in mind the principles of Lenin, right, and the principles of socialism. I think I can leave it there for now. Maybe we can have some more discussion.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Angus. Appreciate it. All right. And for our last opening remark, it will be Tristan from Left Voice.
Hey, comrades. Thanks for having me. I think this is an interesting debate for none of the reasons that people put forward. And let me say why I think this is a very interesting debate and has like implications that go beyond just simply our understanding of Russian imperialism. Or imperialism in general, or like how to characterize countries, but also about how we understand and engage with Marxist fundamentals about the actual fundamental features of like capitalist society. And I think the problem that we have, what I'm hearing, and how we're approaching this question is that it's very empirical and it misses the forest for the trees. Because there are three contradictions that no one is taking up. And I'm just very curious why that is. Because I would say that the conversation needs to be a little more complex or treated as such. I think that Russia has imperialist aspirations and imperialist features, but it itself is not imperialist. And this is based off of three things. One is the position that I think is long-standing, unless anyone's trying to argue otherwise, that new imperialist powers cannot simply emerge without the displacement of older ones. And without, because we've seen this twice in World War I and World War II, and we're seeing as U.S. hegemony is in decline and other countries are challenging that challenge has to come militarily. So I'm trying to understand, how is it that new imperialist powers can emerge without military rupture? Since when was it possible for the capitalists to be so peaceful and genteel with one another over these fundamental features of capitalist economy and competition, which drives it to the apex of war, right? Because I think what we're missing, again, is how that transformation of Russia happened. And I'll say a little caveat to that, because if you think that Russia was a great power, that it was something other than a deformed worker state, that it was another version of capitalism, then I can buy why you think that Russia is just simply trying to return to its status as world power. But if you think that Russia wasn't just simply another version of capitalism, and that its global power was very limited, unfortunately, by, on the one hand, the unity of the imperialists themselves based upon the imposition of U.S. imperialism as the dominant hegemonic force coming out of World War II, who had the economic capacity to rebuild Asia and Europe, which meant that it solidified itself as a superpower by the ways it even penetrated other imperialist markets, making them dependent on themselves, but also through its military might of dropping nukes to let everybody know who's in charge, and creating institutions of capitalist rule, like the IMF, like the World Bank, right? In order, and even the construction of the EU as a way to not just solidify its position as the global hegemon, but to put a check on the spread of the Soviet Union and to do its bit on trying to reclaim that lost territory of that the capitalist market had taken away from them as the byproduct that was deformed and degenerated of the Russian Revolution. So another thing that I want to add, like, to all of that is how Russia economy actually function. Is there anyone on this call who's going to say that Russia dominates the politics and economics of any of the countries that it's trading with, outside of maybe Ukraine, barely, Georgia, kind of, like all of the countries that were mentioned that it trades, sure. In Africa, absolutely, it has investments, but those investments don't add up to it being a dominant force in the politics that's happening in those countries. I think that has to be explained, and because part of tackling that contradiction is also factoring in the role of U.S. imperialism in being an obstruction to the growth of other powers, be they regional or like Russia and China, with more gusto to have, a more global influence that goes outside of its territory. Because also, by the way, the Russian bank is really big in like Central Europe and Eastern Europe and nothing else. Like, so it's really limited to regional, power. And then if you're saying, well, that's a feature of imperialism, then is Iran imperialist? Like, is Turkey imperialist? I think that you start to, and again, how did all these imperialist powers come into being without a global war? How did the capitalists somehow suspend the basis upon which World War I was started in the first place? Someone's saying by developing their economies and developing their economies in competition with each other. Because let's think about imperialism, right, as the highest expression of capitalism, right? Coming out of the development, the evolution of colonialism. Well, all the colonial powers didn't make it. And that's simply because there wasn't enough to go around for everyone. And that basic contradiction has to be explained and dealt with. Why do I say that? Because I think without that, we treat things a little too simply, and then we start to simplify class struggle and take simplified positions. That's why I believe you have all the NATO left who are, subordinating themselves to NATO imperialism because of Russia's reactionary invasion of Ukraine and assault on the Ukrainian citizenry. But I also think that leads us to create so class independence and revolutionary struggles when they don't exist. And I think we do in the US left have a problem of having consistent class independence as anti-imperialist. And that goes from, the revolution that just wasn't. I'm sorry. I know some people like to think that there was a revolution in Syria. Well, situation bore out that actually was a little bit more complex. And I like to point out the history of groups who are here who are taking, and again, this is complex, but I think a simple approach have in the past and in the present supported petty bourgeois entities like the Green Party as a way to go about class independence. And I throw that all in because I think that's important, because this is a fundamental question of how we understand class dynamics and the development of capitalism and its laws, like how not just it produces itself, but like the social relations and under what conditions can those social relations change. I think there are some contradictions that still exist that we have to answer for. And I think that it doesn't help us to give simple answers that flatten the world. And then all of a sudden, again, do the people who agree that Russia is imperialist think serious imperialist? I wonder if there's agreement commonly among the different parties that think that. And on what basis? And why is all of a sudden imperialism this economic category? The standards are lower and different in the 21st century. Those are questions that I think would be really good to discuss more, because I don't want to for one second pretend that this is an easy question. I don't think it is. And I do think, with that being said, I totally agree with the position of not supporting, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, nor NATO, influence in Ukraine and expansion. So yeah, that's it.
All right. Wow. With 14 seconds left. All right. Thank you for that, Tristan. All right. Thank you for all that part. That was some good comments and stuff we can probably talk about. So this next section we're going to do is we're going to ask each group if they have any questions or comments they want to direct to the other group. The person you're asking will not respond immediately. We're just going to, like I said, you can ask group one, can ask group two for, up to 5 minutes or whatever, comment or whatever. And then after your 5 minutes, or if you yield time, it goes to the second group, the third group, and then each group will get 5 minutes to respond. Then we're going to open up for questions and comments at the end. I'm just repeating myself because we had some more people just show up. So going back in the order. So Mark, Jay, if you want to give your any other questions or comments about anything that's been said, and I'll time you for 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. I'm going to start with questions, I think, and it's a question that I want to pose to both groups, and that is, do you think that there is, or there was, in the specific example of the conflict in Ukraine, an element of self-determination? Because I think it sounds like, well, and I'm not sure, and that's why it's a question. But I think that there are perspectives that flatten what's going on or what has gone on in Ukraine down to just a conflict between two powers, imperialist or not. And I think it would be more accurate to say that the war of resistance or the self-determination struggle has been subsumed into an inter-imperialist struggle. But I would like to hear from both groups about what your take is on that. As far as a comment, just one for now, which is, how do new imperialist powers emerge without a global war? That's what they did before World War I. Imperialist powers existed before World War I. Like 1914 was not the emergence of imperialism onto the scene, right? It was the result of the logic of imperialism and the full division of the world being completed and those countries going to war with each other. So I don't think it's unprecedented at all for imperialism to develop without a global war. I also think that the existence of nuclear weapons changes the question of war. I think it, God willing, makes the major powers less likely to go directly to war with each other. But there are other means for imperialism to develop, right? It's oh boy, it might be an imperialism, but somewhere Lenin writes that that the peaceful operation of capitalism and war are two sides of the same coin. So it doesn't make sense to me to say that only one side of that coin can develop an imperialist power, but the other can't. And I'll leave it.
All right, thank you for that, Mark. Up next is Angus and then Tristan for 5 minutes. Any questions at all or comments?
Am I still? Yeah. Yeah, I think that there is that for sure there's a question of national self-determination. I think that is often, exploited and used to justify imperialists' conflict and imperialist jockeying for sure. I think it's obviously their nationalities should be able to declare their independence, to decide where they want to be through a democratic process. I think that sort of now has definitely become difficult, right? Because there's a war happening on top of their heads. So it's sort of difficult to say because I think that their voices have been lost amid the sort of conflict between the West and Russia. That, and then I wanted also to speak a little bit to the argument that you need to have a world war in order for history to happen, which seems like sort of an odd it seems like an odd formulation, and maybe I have it wrong, but I think that obviously world wars do sort of shake the snow globe, right, and everything comes down in different places than they were when they started, but also I think a lot can happen in between, and I think the conflicts and wars that we're seeing now are, part of that process, right? And a part of this sort of, is sort of imperialist jockeying, right? And I think that base, is being made for, Russia to put forward its imperialism and to make moves because of the decline of the U.S. empire, right, and the loss of the unipolar world. So I think it's pretty clear that we're seeing that right now. And the other argument I think is the sort of slippery slope where you say, oh, if Russia's imperialist, then also Syria has to be imperialist, and Iran and everybody else. I think you have to make some kind of a determination, right? And I think yeah, Russia has an enormous military. I mean, not by U.S. standards, but by standards of most of the rest of the world, an enormous military has more nukes, in fact, than the U.S. does. I believe it's still at this point. And has engaged in a lot of overseas interventions, right? Generally a little bit closer to home than what we usually do, but certainly they are out there doing it. So I don't know if we've seen Syria doing anything sort of near that level of what Russia's up to. So thanks.
All right, thank you for that, Angus. And next is Tristan for 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, so two things. I'll start with Angus and then go to Mark. Angus, yeah, I don't think that you need world wars in order for history to happen. I do think you need major conflict in order for the balance of power, the geopolitical balance of power, to be significantly shifted. And if we want to talk about the pre-World War I period, yes, it was a period marked with intense regional conflicts that saw different forms of development between the various colonial powers, reaching its zenith in the global world war, because again, there wasn't enough space for every colony to become an imperialist power, because there's only so much globe to go around. And I do think that the stage of imperialism, which is different than the period leading up to colonial development, means that you can't just simply go back. And I do think that that's why we're seeing a renewal of regional conflict. When's the last time we had a war in Europe, for example? This marks the fact that we are in a process of deep radical change, right? And rupture within the capitalist system itself. So I think that speaks to, the classical features. All the postmodernists were like, history has ended, the class struggle is a thing of the past. The imperialists have figured out how to live happily with each other. No. I will say, Mark, on the question of whether or not there's elements of self-determination, what I would say is that self-determination right now is not on the table in Ukraine, because there is no expression of the independent activity of the working class in Ukraine fighting for themselves. Like, there's no space for it. And we can't invent struggle, even though we want to. That's dangerous, because what that means is we're too busy trying to give space to that, and not enough denunciation of the different, labor bureaucrat stooges, for the Zelensky government. Not saying that, I know Firebrand is not the NATO left, but that's a big part of what they do. And they're parading, all types of agents of Zelensky to speak and be like, we are trade unionists who were self-determination, who have no independent organization for our own. So I think that if we're talking about self-determination, that has to be an important distinction of how we see it happening and how we engage with it. It has to be an activity that the working class and oppressed are taking up itself. And I think that's it. But I still have the questions. To Angus' question, I actually do want to hear from other people. What is your distinction about imperialism, and why does Syria fit with Russia? Because Angus doesn't think it does. So, but other people do. What's up with that?
All right. Well, we'll save it there for if you want to respond to that. So now for the rebuttals, we'll go with Mark, Angus, and then Tristan again for the rebuttals. And then since we're the co-hosts, we get to ask the first questions, because that's what we do, because we're the hosts. And then after that, you, the audience, we got 25 people in attendance here today. So then we'll open up to you for just 2-minute remarks.
The question is Syria. No, I wouldn't argue that Syria was an imperialist power. So I wind up coming to similar conclusions to Tristan, but by a different road. Because I don't think that a self-determination struggle necessarily requires the independent activity of the working class. And that's why we would use the phrase a struggle for self-determination or a national liberation struggle and not a socialist revolution, right? Because we can support, for example, the Chinese Revolution kicking out all the warlords and imperialist powers. And I would still argue that that wasn't an independent movement of the working class. But we would still support it in its goal to kick out various imperialist powers. So I don't think that that's a defining feature of a self-determination struggle that we would support. But I do agree that at the moment, as of now, there isn't what may have been and what I would argue was a struggle for self-determination happening in Ukraine has been fully subsumed by NATO, essentially, or almost fully subsumed, so that the amount of that kind of activity happening is limited. And I don't know that, given the current state of Ukraine, that there's the potential for it at this point necessarily. We would have to see it happen to acknowledge it. So I agree with that conclusion, but I do think we're maybe defining self-determination differently. Yep, leave it there.
All right, thank you for that, Mark. Up next is Angus and then Tristan.
Yeah, I think we got to think about the self-determination question and look at it through the same lens as Lenin did, which was the lens of class. So it's the reasons why the Bolsheviks supported national self-determination, right, was because they didn't want to breed class animosity. Right, or animosity within, sorry, not class, but animosity between different sections, different nationalities of the working class, right? So I don't, I think it's sort of, you don't want to conflate, the soil for national self-determination, right, with class struggle, certainly, and but also remember that, in the two, right, class struggle trumps the struggle for national determination, right? The class struggle is why you sort of analyze and behave as you do towards the national determination struggle. So thanks.
All right, thank you for that, Angus. And finally, Tristan.
Yeah, couple of things. So I will say that China's fight for national liberation absolutely included the activity of the working class, and Trotsky's criticism of the Stalinist Stalinist bureaucracy's policy in China was the fact that it was subordinating the Communist Party of China to the Kuomintang. And so when I'm talking about class struggle and independent activity, that's what I mean. Like, what are the masses themselves doing and acting? Unless we think that it's our job to impose upon the working class and the oppressed the slogans that they're supposed to take up. Imagine us saying to Black communities, the only way towards liberation is self-determination, even and when they're not raising that demand. That would be a little suspect, wouldn't it? That's how I'm understanding like the situation in Ukraine. And that's what I mean by like, a fight for self-determination not existing. The sentiment is there. We don't see that happening like through the self-activity of the working class. And part of that is it's really hard to do because of the authoritarian methods of the Zelensky regime that has attacked the trade unions and the labor movement. The last thing that I was going to say is just to mention that by the way, Russia's economy is largely dependent on exporting of natural resources, and actually not like other imperialist powers or strong imperialist powers on like the export of like manufactured goods. Like they do have some, but to a large degree, they're largely dependent on the export and their natural resources. Their imports are actually, nowhere near the level, obviously, of U.S. or even of China. And the things that they're importing makes them like more dependent upon the manufacturing of goods that China, that the EU, that the US produces, like cars and medical equipment. So I do also want to throw that as a caveat to think about, you know, to have a balanced understanding of like the Russian economy.
All right. Thank you for everyone for that. All right, cool. All right. So we're gonna us the co-host of the show, we're gonna ask a few opening questions too. We can go first because you know that's what we do. All right. Doug, do you want to go first with your opening question?
Sure. This could apply whether you think Russia is imperialist or not. But if it is imperialist, should we support arming those who are opposing them? Because there's also the question that Tristan and others have raised about self-determination. And it should be noted that the official statement of the Ukrainian government in their constitution, Article 85, Section 5, is that they will implement a strategic course of the state to acquire full membership of Ukraine in the European Union and NATO. That is an official statement of the government. And are we going to support the United States arming far-right battalions to fight the Russian military? Are we going to support, trying to push for some working class option? Is there one on the ground? If there is, I'd like to know about it because I've really not seen anything. To me, it seems like it's two groups of reactionaries fighting, and that self-determination has been completely subsumed in a proxy war between the United States and NATO versus the Russian Federation, in which we should not only oppose U.S. arms to Ukraine, but we should not support Ukraine calling for arms because it's not our fight. This is a reactionary war on all sides. And that's the question. Why should we support arming these forces, and who should we be supporting arming? And if there's a separate third force, let's hear it.
All right, thank you for that, Doug. Up first is Mark, Angus, and then Tristan in that order.
No, I don't think we should be supporting the U.S. sending arms to Ukraine at all. We wouldn't, I don't want to do too much history by analogy here, but we wouldn't in, World War I support sending arms to Germany because they're fighting the U.S., right? In an imperialist rivalry, we don't support either imperialist government, which I suspect will be non-controversial with the other panelists. But
all right, thank you for that, Mark. Up next is Angus.
Yeah, as I said, I don't think we should support sending, arms into Ukraine and creating the meat grinder and killing all the, working class people that are dying in those wars over there. I don't think if Russia is imperialist, should we be supporting whoever's opposing them? Well, that would mean basically supporting the United States play. We could have another podcast about is the United States imperialist, but I think that would be a pretty short one. I think you're correct in that this is a war between reactionaries, and we don't need to be supporting any of them.
All right, thank you for that, Angus. Up next is Tristan.
Sorry, I had to relocate. I had to relocate because there was a lot of printing background noise going on. Sorry, but no, I agree because I think that if there was independent activity fighting of the working class in Ukraine, fighting for self-determination, it would change the conversation and our attitude towards armament, I believe. But I do think that because it doesn't exist, you do have a proxy war of two reactionary forces, because there is nothing progressive in Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. It absolutely is a policy of Russia trying to deepen its exploitation of like neighboring countries and directly confront U.S. hegemony, but not to the benefit of the working class, which is why we don't have skin in this fight. However you say that, I messed that up, but who cares? I think that was it.
All right, thank you for that. All right, my question too. So the topic of now self-determination has come up, and this is a comment and a question. I think for a lot of us, this the Euromaidan revolution or revolt or coup or CIA color revolution, whatever you want to call it, depending on who you're asking, happened in 2014. And for me, I remember the first time that I heard about it was the burning of the Union Hall that killed around 40 communist, socialists, and trade unionists by the right sector, who later became the Azov Battalion, who's now getting U.S. government my money to go kill other people right now. So that kind of was painted me as, initially early on, like, oh, Russia's bombing Nazis? Cool. All right. But then, you had to get more into like, because I view that as, I mean, I saw the photos. I don't know why, but they were posted and it was pretty brutal. So that stayed in my head for a while. But now that we have these two, now initially they were two independent republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Lugansk, I can't pronounce it. The Donbass region, those two breakaway republics, they were independent, then they weren't. How do you feel about and now it's different, but early on, would you say you'd support the independence of those two republics, or did you feel that those weren't really even independent republics at all? That's just my question. I'll just kick it over to Mark, Angus, and then Tristan.
So I need to get to the bottom of Maidan and Donetsk. That should be easy in a couple.
Yeah, just cover that up. Like, we give you 30 seconds. No, it's all right. Yeah.
On the first part, I think it's important to emphasize that the what are those fuckers' names? Azov Battalion was not like the motive force behind what happened in 2014. Like, they're not the majority of what was happening. I think there's been a tendency to cast that as strictly CIA motivated. And of course the CIA was there. Something was happening in Eastern Europe. The CIA is going to be there. And it kind of assumes that, like, well, why would anyone in Ukraine be opposed to a pro-Russian administration, given the last 100 years, 200 years of the history of Ukraine and Russia? So there's a movement that happens that ousts the president, and it goes, continues the way that we've seen it go. I don't think that means that that occupying the square and demanding that president be removed is inherently reactionary. I think that there are a lot of forces involved in that movement. As far as the breakaway republics, it's complicated. I'm willing to accept that other people might have a more complete understanding of those. It seems suspicious to me. But Eastern Ukraine is heavily ethnically Russian, so I think you could make an argument that in some situations you would want to think about the right to self-determination of people in those republics. I'm hesitant to put that forward, just because of who seems to be active, or who was active pre-war, in those movements. So,
all right, thank you. Thank you for that, Mark. Right on time. All right, and Angus, you're up next, comrade.
Yeah. I will admit to sort of not being as familiar with that particular situation as maybe I ought to be, and as I'm sure other people in my organization would be. I'll keep it brief, but I think in general, we support people's right to self-determination, and I think that there is some grounds for that support. But I also think that that question has been involved with with this kind of imperialist competition for a really long time, and has been a pawn in there. So I think it has made it sort of complex and a little muddled.
All right, thank you. Sorry, there's a tick and we have to burn it. Sorry, on my dog, and my wife's running around with it. We lost the tick. Sorry. Thank you for that. Up next is Tristan.
No, Mark, I agree. It's complex. I'll sign on to that position but I do want to note two things, because on whose authority are we getting these demands for self-determination of these two regions? Putin? No, we can't go off of that. Like, that's not to be trusted. And I do think that we have to think about the kind of space of reaction that the struggle opened up, not as a direct byproduct of people fighting to remove the presidents and gain independence, but the ways that both powers, US and Russia, infiltrated like the struggle, which notes the strategic importance of not only class independence, but institutions of self-organization, which in every struggle we should be demanding to be built and built on the basis of democratic assemblies where the workers and the oppressed in the movement themselves can determine what their demands are. So it's super clear who's saying what. Because otherwise, you get into the, as Chris was saying, oh, you're fighting fascists? Because first off, there's plenty of fascists between Ukraine and Russia to go. They're everywhere. Like, everyone gets to have their own little piece. So like that also complicates the situation.
All right, thank you for that. Up next for the question is Ben.
Okay, thank you very much, comrades. My question is, how does your view on the question of Russia's imperialism show up in your practical political work? How should a socialist group in the U.S. support revolutionaries, and by that I mean, genuine revolutionaries in Ukraine and Russia? What are, kind of the stakes in practically speaking? Thanks.
All right. Up next for this is Mark, Angus, and then Tristan. And also, if you want to get on Stack, this is it for us co-hosts. If you want to get on Stack, just write Stack, and Ben will be handling that part of the section too. So, but yes. So if you could answer Ben's question, and Mark, if you can go first.
In terms of on the ground day-to-day activity, it's really limited, right? I mean, we're communists in a small organization in the U.S., and so there just isn't that much that we can actually do in terms of like material support or like even particularly important political support in terms of like shifting the course of things, right? Because we're just not there. We don't have like an international sister organization or affiliate or whatever in Ukraine, and we're small. So it's our actual activity it winds up being, the thing that we can push back against is being in opposition to American imperialism and NATO. But then also debates and discussions like this where we're sharpening kind of our analytical Marxist tools for a time in the future where we can intervene. We'll be prepared to do it.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Mark. Up next is Angus.
Similar to that, as far as we don't have anyone on the ground in our organization in Ukraine. But I think, what we can do mostly is carry on our work here, right? Because, the capitalism in the US is 100% a factor in all of this. And so I think it's everybody's responsibility to fight against their own ruling class, and each other's whenever possible, right? But the ruling class that's right in front of you is the best one for you to go after.
All right, thank you for that, Angus. And Tristan.
Yeah, so I just want to say that it's really important to note that political activity always have practical implications, even when we don't have the forces to apply them right now. What do I mean by that? Because it's so funny that we have shared positions, even though we got there differently. I like it. I love it. That's what makes these debates also important. We take a position that's neither for NATO aggression or Russian aggression. It means we're much more likely to spot the real thing when it comes. And that has huge implications in terms of our ability to have a political relationship with independent forces that would come out of Ukraine. I do want to point out, though, that I think an important political activity of ours has to be to always denounce the reactionary measures of the Zelensky regime against the left. That's what's so shameful about the folks who are endorsing more arms to Ukraine. They're almost silent or look over the fact that Zelensky is repressing the socialist left there. And I think we have to speak out against that and also speak out against the Russian government's repression of anti-war protesters, and the socialist left there.
All right. Thank you for that very much, everybody. So I'm now going to kick it over to Ben for the comments from the crowd. Just keep in mind, it'll be 2 minutes. Like I said, 2 minutes each. Like I said, just be respectful. Okay to disagree. So we're going to try to go this for about 30 minutes or so. And all right, I'll kick it over to Ben to start the chair and stack and everything, and I can shut the hell up.
All right, thanks, Chris. So right now we have Steve, and then stack is open.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. Great discussion. Thanks for putting this on. I think there's some misunderstanding about what self-determination means. I think we're all opposed to U.S. arms to Ukraine, and that's important. But there have been many examples of self-determination which then subsumed under imperialist conflict. In World War One, socialists supported Serbia against Austro-Hungary, which was trying to take it over. But when the Russians came into it, it became an inter-imperialist conflict. So we didn't support either side. The same is a similar thing in Kosovo, where we supported independence of Kosovo against Serbia. But when the U.S. got involved, then we had to be primarily against the U.S. because we're against our own imperialism. So there can be situations of self-determination which then get subsumed, and we have to understand that. And as far as self-determination, it doesn't have to be led by the working class, as I put in the chat. Trotskyists in the 1930s supported Ethiopia against imperialist Italy. Ethiopia at the time was run by a feudal monarch. So it has very little to do with, is there active working class activity? As far as Lenin was concerned, it was a question of national self-determination. And then quickly on left, I think Left Voice's position leaves it open to a mild form of campism. I think that Left Voice's position is there was a direct war between the U.S. and Russia that would support Russia against the U.S. And I believe that's the wrong position to take. We should be opposed to both sides. As Lenin said in Socialism or War, we do not support slave owner of 100 slaves against the slave owner of 200 slaves, because they're both slave owners. They're both imperialists. I think we have to oppose them both.
Okay, stack is open, and if any of you guys want to respond to that as well on the panel, please feel free to jump in as well.
Well, I do want to talk about this open to self-campism, because I think the issue for us, I understand that concern. Controversially, we would say that militarily, we would be for a military defeat of U.S. imperialism if it went to direct war with Russia. And I think that is an important position because it's a position that is based off of like the balance of forces under capitalism and how we can relate in kind to the working class of those countries. Because it's funny to me how that can be the case where we oppose none, but yeah, and I get it's different when it's a question of self-determination, even if a country fights for it. But again, what is the rubrics that we're using to measure? And I think I have an issue with the oversimplification, which on the flip side has to me open up a bunch of folks to campism of a different variety. And again, a big issue that I have with Firebrand is the characterization of the Syrian revolution. And I think that is a complete capitulation, not just simply to self-determination, but I don't know how to put my finger to it. But I think there's something, there's something problematic about wanting everything to be so simple.
Thank you, Tristan. JR, go ahead.
Yeah, comrades, thank you for doing this and setting this up. It's been a really great discussion, and enjoyed like all sides. It's really given me like a lot of food for thought. I'd like to kind of like I guess the main remark that really had me kind of like sit on was the remark made by I think it was Comrade Mark from Firebrand, on the basis of like that nuclear weapons really changes pretty much like everything regarding to war. And I was just like flipping through like imperialism, and I found that remark especially like true towards chapter 7, where Lenin, like, at the end asked the question of what means other than war could there be under capitalism to overcome the disparity between the development of productive forces and accumulation of capital on the one side, and the division of colonies and spheres of influence for finance capital on the other. I haven't read this book in quite some time, so I was just like skimming it through like the conversation that was being had here, and I'm just like, I guess wondering like what is like what would be like an answer to that question is what other means can be produced for this. I also had like, I guess, a can of worms to open, and it might be a very dumb question, which is okay because we're all comrades here, and it's been a while since I've been in these spaces, but might as well just, throw it in. I'm wondering, like, like, how do people feel like about China, for example? And again, this is a good faith, like, question. It's not meant to, like, attack anybody or anything like that. But I'm wondering, like, is there anybody, like, other perspectives out there that view China as imperialist, regarding, like how they interfere with, or have relations with other countries, or even themselves internally? And yeah, I would like to hear perspectives on that basis. And again, can of worms to be opened. Don't want to get into too much of a heated discussion on this basis as well, because I respect the people that hosted this, and that might leave space for, I guess, another meeting on that basis.
Thanks, JR. Next up, we have Jason.
China's totally imperialist, and so is Iran and Turkey and Russia and the U.S. obviously, and they're all involved in Syria, right? I don't understand how in the 21st century an annexationist invasion of a country could or would happen that wasn't imperialist, that isn't national capital spilling outside the boundaries of its nation, with force, and going after the land and labor of, in this case, a longtime semi-colony, Ukraine. So it confounds me to not characterize this as imperialist, Russia. But if I have a little time, I kind of want to turn to the Green Party question. First of all, you play dirty, Tristan. You play dirty, and I like it. But we reject that position in Firebrand. We think that was a mistake of the ISO, and it came from an over focus and a fixation on a rejection of the Democrats, and a desperation. I also think kind of right opportunism, like a desperation to appeal to people whose heads are in the electoral space. And so we've made a break from that. And, at least for now, we like to say there's really no electoral solutions to our problems, and our power is found elsewhere. So, yeah, thanks but you're right to ding our former organization on that, but we do.
Thank you, Jason. Up next is Matthew, and then after that, we'll give the panelists a chance to respond to some of these questions.
Hi, folks. I want to thank all the comrades here. Sorry I was late, but from what I've heard so far, this discussion seems to be really a good one and definitely needed. So I want to thank everybody here for coming. I just wanted to ask a question because in trying to study and become smarter about this subject, I've really had a hard time, honestly, and the thing that occurred to me when I was listening to all this, so I'm just going to ask the question and just leave it there because I'm not sure, exactly how to explain myself when I just ask it. So here it is. Are we class aligned, or are we nationally aligned for or against? And how does that, considering the question, how does that affect, how we view the imperialist struggle between the nations today and even historically? So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. All right. Yeah. So guys, if you wanted to take some time to, I guess maybe Mark, if you had anything, if not, you can always pass your time.
Yeah, I have a couple things. I was going to say, Tristan, unlike the Russian military, I'm not going to get into Syria today. But I do think the question that the comrade JR mentioned, and also something Tristan brought up earlier, the question of war and where war is happening, is important. So that line from imperialism the question about like what avenue other than war. We do see war breaking out. As Tristan mentioned, the kind of regional, the increase in regional conflicts happening now, which I would argue was also the case in the 90s in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. You had wars in Serbia and Kosovo and so forth. And that's not to say that like the situation now is the same as then or anything like that, but that the kind of destruction that takes place when the balance of forces between imperialism shifts, I think is something that I'm glad comrades brought up. I had another thing, I think. Oh, China. I think that in my little kickoff at the beginning, I was trying to explain the ways in which I think we should consider Russia imperialist despite it not looking like imperialism. I think that with China, I would have to do far fewer of those caveats or explanations. I think China, especially given its regional influence, its economic activity in Africa, is much more clearly an imperialist power, or not more clearly an imperialist power, but it looks more like what we would expect an imperialist power to look like, and that's for a variety of reasons, not least of which is that the efficiency of NATO's encroachment or containment of Russia since the fall of the USSR has not been the same as the relationship between the US and China.
Thank you, comrade. Go ahead, Angus.
Yes. So, just talk about a few of those questions. Yeah, I would also characterize China as imperialist. And I think it's interesting. So much of the conflict that we're seeing in the world has to do with kind of the tech minerals, right? Either rare earth minerals or, lithium, all of that kind of stuff. And, China controls a lot of that. And so, I think there's a way to look at Ukraine through that. You got Trump trying to sort of make the deal to get the minerals out of Ukraine as well. So, I don't know, just an interesting wrinkle. I'll answer the Greens a little bit. So, that was I don't know if that was maybe a little ding at us as well, but we did support the Greens in the last election, and I think maybe we haven't got there, but I think you do have to take some kind of a stand in elections, and also I don't think there's any such thing as being too stringent about independence from the Democratic Party. I think you can you cede some ground by sort of saying, well, we're not involved. So I think that's where the working class's head is at largely, like it or not. So I think you have to be in there doing that. And as far as are we class aligned, not totally sure if that question is if I understand all that question, but yes. So thanks.
Thank you, comrade. Go ahead, Tristan.
Yeah, it's hard not to talk about your position on the Green Party, Angus, but maybe I'll do that later or on another show because I think it has problems. And it kind of alludes to why I'm like so fixated on the question of method, because I think that it really is important for us to fight for a Marxist method that always underpins our analysis of the current situation on a materialist basis, and I do think that the working class has options other than what is presented to us by the capitalists themselves. And I want to say to Jason on the notion that you find so crazy, how can one country fight to annex another? Well, then we just don't live in a world where regional powers exist, because regional powers do that. And that's actually a step in the direction of becoming an imperialist power. And I hope that my position on Russia, gives you an inkling of what my position on China would be, which is that it is much more has much more imperialist features than Russia for sure. I mean, and this is the thing that I think is super important to understand in order to combat again this postmodernist, post history, perspective that people are putting out, where the belief is that war, like global war, is not possible. The capitalists are too smart to be able to do that. They have the power to avoid these things. But the truth is they don't, because the nature of capitalist competition and expansion means that they're always on a collision course. Even though, and this is what's so crazy, y'all, decoupling is a myth. The United States can't decouple from China, and China can't decouple from the US, and yet they're still on a fucking crash course. And that is the contradiction of the nation state system in the context of a global economy that is interconnected in 1,000 different ways, which is why we have to fight for class against nation, right? We support obviously the fight for self-determination, but on the basis of breaking the chain of imperialist and capitalist aggression and existence. And we know that only through a federated, system of Soviets can we get to the ultimate goal, which is not a worker state. Our ultimate goal is communism, a classless and stateless society. And that's what we want to fight for. And the way that we get that is through the worker state that crushes the resistance that is going to come after a successful revolution. Because revolution is a very super concrete act. And we have to just be realistic about that, right? No idealism. We don't have space for that. And so this is again why I'm so big on method. And also, I want to emphasize these questions are complex, and I'm queasy, even in a lot of ways about my own positions. But I'm confident in them because I have to go where the objective reality takes me. That's why Trotsky in Learn to Think is hey, if the fucking fascists are giving arms to national liberation struggle, yeah, we'll take it. It's complex. That's all I'm trying to say. It's really nasty and dirty. And with that, I'm glad we at least are not the NATO left in this call. Or people who have a nostalgia of what Russia was, a million moons ago, and think there's anything progressive about the Putin regime. No, we have to reject that. So that's it.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Tristan. Up next, we got Chris, and then we are getting close to time. So if anyone else wants to get on stack, consider this like a last call.
Thank you. I'm gonna take a quote from a person. I don't know if anyone knows him. Who's Has Aldine. No, I'm kidding. Okay, I'm not doing that. Okay, we're not doing this show. Okay, that's an inside joke. That's Left Opposition Podcast humor. All right. This was a comment from a friend of ours here, Devin, who actually, this is a really good question. I want to ask everyone on the panel this one too. Does the question of provocation enter into determinations of imperialism? Does a sustained multi-decade role of the West in deliberately creating the conditions for a Ukraine-Russia conflict with the explicit goal of the collapse, balkanization, looting of Russia in the face of the multiple attempts by Russia to resolve this non-militarily first enter into consideration? Why or why not?
Okay, great. And so you guys can feel free to jump in on that.
Just two things. Putin didn't have to invade Ukraine. He didn't have to. I understand he was, it was one of those things where he's kind of forced to because NATO is clearly encroaching on his border, and that's provocative. But what we're seeing in Putin's policy is not just simply a defensive position. It shows a person who absolutely wants Russia to be a world power. No qualms about it. And not for the benefit of the working class, of course. And that's why I think it shows there's nothing progressive in what NATO is doing. Nothing. That's why it's crazy that people all of a sudden are like NATO is somehow the champion of self-determination. Since when did that happen? No, but at the same time, there's everything that you think reactionary is what the Putin regime represents, and their invasion of Ukraine represents that. Absolutely. So yeah, that may not have answered your question at all. Sorry, like that's what I got.
I can hop on this too, and I imagine this will be maybe my last comment because I think we're close to it. Because I think that's it was Gavin. I think the dynamic being described there isn't irrelevant, but it's also not. I don't think that like whether a country is imperialist is a question of like who hit first, you know. And I think, and this actually leads to, I think, where some of our differences on whether something is imperialist comes about, because NATO is trying to incorporate I would consider it a former colony of Russia, and Russia, because of the logic of imperialism and the way that it's trying to establish itself, has to respond in some way. Didn't have to be a full-scale ground invasion, obviously, but that's what they went with, because Russia's operating according to the logic of imperialism. And so this is what, so when comrades say like, a country has imperialist features, that suggests to me that it's acting according to the logic of imperialism and following those sets of pressures and incentives. And so then I don't know how having imperialist features doesn't make a country imperialist. And it seems to me like that definition makes imperialism ultimately like a synonym for big, which I don't think is the most dynamic way to understand. I'm also not sure if I answered your question.
It wasn't mine, but I was just answering. It was a comment in the chat. It was just because of the podcast. No one can see the chat in the Zoom. So that's why I was asking. And Angus, any comments you have before we wrap this up on that question?
Yeah. I think it's clear that there were provocations, right? And there's nothing to absolve the West. There's nothing to absolve NATO, and by NATO I mean the U.S. From these provocations for sure. But on the other hand, how you respond to provocations is on you, right? And also, I think that question too, right? Given that these are two, or a number of ruling classes battling each other, we don't, I think, have a duty to pick one, right? And to find a good guy and a bad guy in that situation, right? It's all bad guys all the way down. So I think those kind of questions, are interesting to think about. But I think we sort of need to stay focused on the working class and the fight for its liberation.
All right. And with that being our final comment, I just want to say this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. This comes up a lot between all of us. Yeah, everyone, you can't see it. Everyone's standing up, clapping right now, going nuts. It's on Zoom, folks, but trust me, on a podcast, it's all coming out wonderfully here. So thank you very much. I think that we're like, I don't want to say other people who support Russia or not, good on politics, but we know who they are. Yeah. Anyway, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Tristan from Left Voice. I want to thank Angus from the Independent Socialist Group and Mark J from the Firebrand Communist. It was great. This was a nice conversation. I hope we can have more of these conversations where we can, agree and disagree and not have it be a bloodbath at all. It was awesome. So hopefully we can see you all again. And with that being said, we'll be probably recording in a couple more weeks. We might take a little time off. We've been busy. But thank you all for being here. Thank you all to those 25 people at one point in the audience. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the questions. And I'll just say by this wrap, keep up the fight, keep up the struggle, and we will see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Fight. I starve. I die. Yeah. Russia.